headquarters in New York, I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. On the brief today, Emma Chandra in London on Prime Minister Boris Johnson's sharp rebuke by the British Supreme Court. And here in New York, Marty Schenker on the growing call for impeachment proceedings against President Trump. So, Emma, let's start with you. It was unanimous, 11-0, as I understand. Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, came out and said he will abide by it even though he thinks it's wrong. Just listen for a moment to what he had to say.
Obviously, this is a verdict that we will respect, and we respect the judicial process. I have to say I strongly disagree with what the justices have found. I don't think that it's right, but we will go ahead and, of course, Parliament will come back.
So there he's about to hop on an airplane to rush back to London. What comes next for Prime Minister Boris Johnson, Emma?
Well, that is the big question, David. To be told today by the highest court in the land that he had acted unlawfully, that he gave unlawful advice to the Queen. That has certainly led to calls from opposition leaders, including Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, for him to resign. We're told that Boris
Emma, I'm so sorry. I'm going to interrupt you. We now have playback from Prime Minister Boris Johnson with President Trump just moments ago.
The results are going to start to show in November, but it looks to me like he is making great progress. So it's an honor to have you here. We're going to be discussing trade. We can quadruple our trade with U.K. and we can, I think, really do a big job. Bob Lighthizer is here, our trade representative. Your trade representative is here. And they're already scheduled today to continue negotiations. But we can have substantially more trade with UK, and we look forward to doing that. So we'll talk about other things also. It's great to have you, Boris.
Don, thank you very much. It's great to be here, and I certainly hope that we can make a lot of progress quite fast on trade. We've got our Secretary of State for International Trade, Liz Truss, is here, and we hope to get going on that, always remembering that the NHS is not for sale, but everything else, because there's a huge amount we can do. And I guess we'll also talk a bit about Iran and some of those difficult issues where I think we share a common perspective, and we want to dial things down, but also make sure that people in the Gulf don't get the wrong idea about what they can get away with. That's a complicated issue. But we hope to make progress there as well.
We'll be talking about many things, and we look forward to it, and we'll start in just a minute. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Mr. Johnson, some of your critics are saying that you should resign because you misled the Queen with regard to shutting Parliament down. How do you respond to that?
Well, as I said earlier on, thank you very much. As I said earlier on, let's be absolutely clear. We respect the judiciary in our country. We respect the court. I disagree profoundly with what they had to say. I think it was entirely right to go ahead with a plan for a Queen's speech. This is the longest period we haven't had a Queen's speech for 400 years. We've got a dynamic domestic agenda we need to be getting on with. More police on the streets, investment in our National Health Service, improving our education. We need to get on with that. And frankly, I think we need to get on with Brexit. That's the overwhelming view of the British people. Whether they voted to leave or remain, they want to get this thing done by October the 31st. And that's what we're going to do.
Mr. President. That was a very nasty question from a great American reporter.
Was that an American reporter?
An American reporter.
Very nice.
I think a good one.
But I think he was asking a question, to be fair, that a lot of British reporters would have asked.
Now that we have that out of the way. He's not, I'll tell you, I know him well. He's not going anywhere. Don't worry about him. Okay, go ahead. Any other questions?
Any advice for the Prime Minister as how he should deal with the judges?
No, I think he's dealing very well. Everything I see is what. Look, I watch it very closely. He's a friend of mine. I tend to watch friends closer than enemies, but the enemies you have to watch in a different way. I think he's doing very well. It's a complicated subject, but they took a vote, and the vote was, I was there. I happened to be there the day of that vote.
Were you there in the vote?
I made a prediction even. I even made a prediction. It was a correct prediction. And, you know, that was a long time ago, and it takes a man like this to get it done. And they have to get it done. Otherwise, it'd be a terrible thing to do it any other way. I don't see another vote. I don't see anything happening. I think he's going to get it done.
Do you think he will?
Mr. President, what was your reaction when you heard these UK's Supreme Court decision?
What was your reaction?
I had no reaction. I just asked Boris, and, to him it's another day in the office. He's a professional. It's just another day in the office.
Yeah, well, it's tomorrow is another day in Parliament. That's what.
We had Boris, the first couple of months I think we were 0 for 7 with the Supreme Court. And since then, we won the wall, we won asylum, we won some of the biggest ones. We've had a great streak going. But we started off, we were 0 for 7, and then as you will report, in fact, the first time we won, you were like shocked that we won. And since then, we've almost run the table. We've won a lot of decisions. So I'm sure that's going to happen to you.
Well, we're not counting our chickens, and we're full of respect, as I say, for the justices of our Supreme Court. But we're going to push on with. We're going to respect what the court had to say, but we're going to get on and deliver Brexit. I think that's what the British people want.
In other words, he's been very nice to the court, please. Okay. He has total respect for the court. Yeah, Jeff.
Mr. President, on a separate subject, can you explain why aid to Ukraine was stopped?
Because I think that other countries should be paying also. Why is the United States the only one paying to Ukraine? And I've been talking about this for a long time, not only with respect to Ukraine, but a lot of other countries. But frankly, why isn't Germany? I just met with the Chancellor. Why isn't Germany? Why isn't France? Why aren't these other countries paying payment? Why are we paying all the time? And nobody's given, I believe, more to Ukraine. President Obama used to send pillows and sheets. I sent anti-tank weapons and a lot of things to Ukraine. We think that it's very important. And both, by the way, I don't know if you know it or not, that payment was made. But I wanted to get other countries. Other countries should also pay, because frankly, it affects them more. I mean, that's a barrier, that's a wall between Russia and the UK. And they don't pay. And why are they not paying? Why is it always the United States that's paying? And I made that loud and clear. I told that to Mick Mulvaney. I told it to a lot of people. Where's Mick, wherever he is? I told it to a lot of different people. I told it to Mike. I told it to two Mikes. I told it to Steve. I keep asking the same. I said it to Wilbur Ross. I keep asking the same question. Why is it that the United States is always paying these foreign countries and other foreign countries that, frankly, are much more affected, they're not? So I said, hold it up. Let's get other people to pay. And then everybody called me, oh, please, can we pay? And I said, and there was never any quid pro quo. The letter was beautiful. It was a perfect letter. It was unlike Biden, who, by the way, what he said was a horror. And ask how his son made millions of dollars from Ukraine, made millions of dollars from China, even though he had no expertise whatsoever, okay? So what he did was a real problem. With us, there was no pressure applied, no nothing. Okay, folks, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, we've been watching and listening to President Trump with Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Taped just a short time ago, and there was an awful lot in that exchange, both about whether Prime Minister Boris Johnson would be stepping down, resigning as Prime Minister, and also about those payments to Ukraine, whether they really held up or not. Big issues on both sides of the Atlantic, and we have the two people who are perfect to talk about it. Emma Chandra is still with us over in London, and we have Marty Schenker right here in New York. So let's start with Boris Johnson and the resignation issue. I was asking you, Emma, when we were interrupted, what happens next? It appears that Boris Johnson is not inclined to resign.
No, he's not inclined to resign, and that is surprising given the magnitude of the decision from the Supreme Court today. The very fact that it was ruled that the advice he gave the Queen was unlawful. In any other situation, you would imagine there would be a resignation, and certainly the opposition leaders of opposition parties here in the UK have been calling for that resignation. Boris Johnson saying he will not resign and will continue to get on with Brexit, or taking the UK out of the European Union. We heard there as well that he will be flying back to the UK early, cutting his trip to New York short. We also understand that he's to have a conference call with his cabinet before he gets on that plane. And of course, Parliament will be reconvened tomorrow. So we'll get a better sense of where things go from there once the Prime Minister is back in the UK, and also once Parliament has been recalled. But obviously, as you saw there, he was discussing with the President the possibility of a trade deal between the UK and the US. But of course, that can't happen until Brexit happens.
So, Marty, as we watch those two leaders there is a relationship that goes back a while. We're mindful of the fact that President Trump is really invested in Boris Johnson. And in fact, even at the speech at the UN today, he doubled down on it, it felt like. And in those remarks, doubled down. He's really going to do what he can for his friend Boris.
You know, it's kind of strange. I feel that Donald Trump's perceived relationship with Boris Johnson is a little different than Boris Johnson's relationship with Donald Trump. And it's not clear just how personal that is. I think Boris Johnson is astute politician, and he will take advantage of the perception that he's good friends with Donald Trump. But once it's not to his advantage, he'll divorce him immediately.
In the meantime, Emma, Boris Johnson said he is going to get out by Halloween, as he said, from the EU, one way or the other. It doesn't appear that he's got a clear path to do that. How are the markets reacting? How are people pricing this out over there?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, David, because obviously we saw this huge decision today from a constitutional perspective. But in terms of the market reaction, you obviously in this situation, you take a look at the pound. It did rise against the dollar, up around 0.6 at one point and briefly touched 1.25. But we were there a few days ago, and a lot of people saying actually perhaps the move should have been bigger. But we've seen some notes from analysts and strategists at banks today, certainly one from Danske Bank, that says actually this decision takes us no closer or further away from a no-deal Brexit, and we'll only really know which way we're headed once we have a general election and we know who is likely to win that. Of course, Boris Johnson again today calling for a general election, and actually we heard from Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, speaking at the Labour Party conference in the last hour or so, saying he also wants a general election, but he wants to do it when he knows that a no-deal Brexit has been taken off the table.
Marty, let's turn to the other part of that conversation. We normally wouldn't expect to hear about payments delayed to Ukraine and a discussion between the British Prime Minister and the U.S. President. But there's more to this story right now, and it's interesting how he's trying to explain what happened.
I mean, that is, from my understanding, the first time Donald Trump has sought to explain why those payments, the shipments and payments to Ukraine were delayed. Throughout this controversy over that issue, no one could explain it. Donald Trump is now putting out the narrative that he wanted to make other allies pay for the Ukrainian aid, and that is why he held it up. That's the first time we've heard that.
And the grounds seem to be shifting here a little bit, because Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, had been saying, let's just not deal with impeachment. Then she came with a letter and said, well, it's a different day. And now we have some moderates in some swing districts who are changing their position on the Democrat side.
Yeah, that's pretty significant. These are from districts that are very tough for the Democrats to keep. And for them to come out and call for impeachment, which politically is viewed as poisonous to the Democrats, is very significant. And she's meeting with the chairman of her committees this afternoon at 4 o'clock, and we'll get more insight into just whether or not impeachment is going to go forward. There's no question momentum is building for that.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, thank you so much to Marty Schenker, our Chief Content Officer, and also to Amma Chandra reporting over from London. Thank you very much for sticking with us, both of you. Coming up, the odds of a no-deal Brexit after the British Supreme Court's ruling. And we talk with Reva Goujon of Stratfor. That's next. And this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television. I'm David Weston. The United Kingdom Supreme Court issued its ruling today in the challenge to the suspension of Parliament, and it was unanimous.
The decision to advise Her Majesty to prorogue Parliament was unlawful.
I welcome the judgment this morning.
It had the effect of frustrating or preventing the ability of Parliament to carry out its constitutional functions without reasonable justification.
I strongly disagree with what the justices have found.
It demonstrates a contempt for democracy and an abuse of power by him.
I don't think that it's right, but we will go ahead and, of course, Parliament will come back.
Today is not a win for any individual or cause. It's a win for parliamentary sovereignty.
We welcome now Reva Goujon. She is Stratfor Vice President for Global Analysis. She comes to us from Austin. So, Reva, as far as you can assess the likelihood, because there are a lot of uncertainties still surrounding the situation, does this increase or decrease the likelihood of a no-deal Brexit?
Well, it certainly adds to the Brexit drama, but I wouldn't say this legal bombshell is a game changer. You still are dealing with fundamental constraints here on the Irish backstop, and this sort of takes the wind out of the brinksmanship of Boris's his strategy to get an 11th hour deal or a compromise on the Irish backstop. But remember, the opposition was going to wait until October 17th at the EU Council meeting to then decide its next steps, to see if Boris Johnson was going to actually request request the delay from the EU. That is still within the Prime Minister's right. And so we're still on the same timetable of those remaining 2 weeks in October. That's when it turns to most likely a no confidence motion or a resignation by Boris Johnson himself, where he can play martyr in an electoral campaign and say this is a people versus parliament issue, and then we're just going to have more prolonged Brexit uncertainty. So I still think we're in the same dynamic, but the UK is probably going to avert the worst case scenario of a no-deal Brexit.
After this ruling, Boris Johnson once again came out and said he is going to take the UK out of the European Union by October 30th. Is there a way for him to do that with a deal, as it were? Because didn't Michel Barnier offer a deal that would basically have effectively a border across the Irish Sea?
Well, so there's still a number of sticking points around that Irish backstop. There is potential for a Northern Ireland-only backstop, which Brussels has already agreed to, so that's not an issue on the EU side. The issue is on London's side, whether you could get a deal like that through Parliament. And so now, as we see Boris Johnson's next steps, he has to basically go to the EU Council with Parliament now still trying to resist him. The options aren't looking good for him. He faces defeat after defeat in Parliament. So I think if we were to see an extreme option, he could try to prorogue Parliament again, even extend the date. Of course, that would have huge legal ramifications. But in the end, he's going to be preparing for an election. And so he has to show that he did everything possible to try to make Brexit happen. But in the end, I think the legal constraints are going to prevent him from doing so.
Reva, let's turn to Iran. We heard President Trump address the United Nations General Assembly today and once again have strong words about Iran, accusing them, saying that they were responsible for those attacks in Saudi Arabia, saying he will not take the sanctions off. There was some hope that he might meet with President Rouhani while he's here. It doesn't look like it's going to happen. What's the next step?
Look, it was exposed on June 20th, and it's very obvious now this White House does not want a shooting war with Iran. And we have to remember Iranian strategy here. It is to escalate to a breaking point with the White House in return for sanctions relief and use that to then bargain over de-escalation. And so at this point, there's still more room for escalation. The Saudi attack exposed the vulnerabilities of not only Saudi Arabia, but also its Gulf neighbors and critical energy infrastructure. Saudi Arabia now operating at reduced redundancy, and so further attacks could have a much more serious disruption to energy markets. And Iran is essentially holding the global economy hostage still. And so as far as next steps, of course, we're back in a stalemate, but Iran knows how to break a stalemate. And if the U.S. tries to avoid military action, say in an option of another cyber attack against Iran, that would still compel an Iranian response. That could be a cyber attack. It could also be another military attack.
Reva, as you know, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, likes to talk in terms of winning and losing. If Iran, in fact, can have more attacks that we can't protect our neighbors or our allies from, as it happened in Saudi Arabia, and if we're not willing to really attack them, is Iran winning?
In a sense, you know, Iran is playing a weak hand extremely well, and that strategy is working. And so we still have this massive deterrence dilemma. The U.S. can get allies to, you know, provide naval escorts for its vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. It can bolster air defenses, but Iran still has the ability to carry out some pretty crippling attacks. And so with that deterrence dilemma on the table, I think Iran still has options here.
Okay, Reva, thank you so much for joining us today. That's Reva Goujon of Stratfor. More Balance of Power next, and this is Bloomberg. You're watching Balance of Power. I'm David Weston. It's time now for a check on the markets, and for that, we turn to Abigail Doolittle.
Thanks, David. And at this point, we're seeing a bit of a bearish reversal, and it's mild risk-off tone with that reversal. Earlier, stocks had been higher. You can see right now the Dow and the S&P 500 down between 0.2% and 0.4%. Earlier, the S&P 500 up 0.5%, really underperforming, though, both the tech-heavy NASDAQ and the small-cap Russell 2000. Let's take a look at a chart on the day of the NASDAQ 100 futures. At the highs, the NASDAQ 100 futures up more than 0.5%. So we're looking at a 0.5% reversal to the downside. This is President Trump was speaking at the UN, really criticizing China around trade, and in particular singling out some tech issues. Let's take a look at some of the tech movers dragging on this NASDAQ 100. First up, Netflix down 3.5%. The price target was cut there by Pivotal by 30% to $350 on rising content costs. As for one of the tech stocks or companies that was mentioned by President Trump, Micron down 1.2%. And then we also see Tesla down 6%. This as the Tesla of China is having some issues. Perhaps Tesla here in the U.S. Trading lower in sympathy. And then finally, one of the big stories over the last several days. Let's take a look at oil. This is, of course, a 7-day chart of oil. Today, oil is down almost 2%. This is Saudi Arabia is assuring the world, assuring traders and investors that supply is coming back on after that attack last week. But we see over this time period, we do have oil up 5.1% right now, close to $58 a barrel for WTI crude. David, this, of course, is a risk asset. Can't get out of a range, very similar to the S&P 500, still stuck below 3,000 and has not put in an all-time high anytime recently. Investors looking for that next big directional cue, David.
Thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle. It's time now for the stock of the hour. Today we're looking at Fiat Chrysler, which is extending declines after one of the company's engineers was charged by the United States over diesel emissions problems. Bloomberg's Kaylee Lyons is here with more.
Yeah, so these are the first criminal charges the U.S. has brought in relation to this diesel emissions probe. It's a Fiat senior engineer essentially charged with misleading both regulators and the public about diesel emissions from 2011 to 2017. And of course, this is interesting because it dovetails off what we got out of Europe earlier today. You had Daimler being charged 870 million euros from Germany in regard to diesel rigging, and then also Volkswagen, the CEO, Ries, as well as its chairman and former CEO, all charged with market manipulation, all related to diesel. So not a great day for these auto stocks and the diesel emissions investigation.
A scandal that's been going on for some time and just keeps on going, it feels like. At the same time, that wasn't the only bad news for Fiat. They also got a tax ruling out of Europe, which wasn't too good.
They did. They actually lost that one. It was a victory for the EU, which had been pursuing allegations regarding its relationship, its tax arrangement in Luxembourg. So Fiat lost that. On the flip side, though, you had Starbucks actually winning that case. The court saying the EU just didn't have enough evidence. Now, for both of those companies, it wasn't super financially material, only about 30 million euros. But what I think for the market it really raises is what's going to happen with Apple, which is facing a record $14 billion tax bill. And what the court didn't do today was say that Margaret Vestager and the EU Commission EU Competition Commission is overreaching by looking into these tax deals because, of course, it's an antitrust body, but the court essentially supports their right to do that with these rulings. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with Apple.
As you say, the tech tax rulings are the ones to watch. Those are the really big ones on the horizon. Thanks so much to Kaylee Lyons. Up next, President Trump made tax cuts the centerpiece for his economic growth plan. So nearly 2 years later, what effect did they have? We're going to talk with President Obama's former economic advisor, Jason Furman, live from New York. And this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television. I'm David Weston. We have some breaking news now. There will be remarks given by Vice President Joe Biden in Wilmington, Delaware, a short time from now. And in those remarks, we've seen a version of them now. He will call for impeachment of President Trump if President Trump ignores the document request. This, of course, comes out of the situation where the president reportedly had a conversation, perhaps multiple conversations, with the head of Ukraine and raised questions about Vice President Biden's son and whether there should be an investigation by Ukraine into Vice President Biden's son. And now increasingly there are calls to have this revealed. According to the statute, the director of the National Intelligence should be turning it over to the intelligence committees on Congress. Hasn't done it yet. And there are increasing calls from Democrats now on the Hill, putting pressure on Nancy Pelosi to proceed with impeachment proceedings. So now, once again, Vice President Biden, in some remarks to be delivered a short time from now at 2:30 this afternoon Eastern Time, and Wilmington, Delaware, he will be calling for the impeachment of the president if he ignores the document request. Bloomberg Television will take those remarks from Vice President Biden live at 2:30 Eastern Time. And now we want to turn to the economy. The U.S. economy continues to send mixed signals, with companies cutting back on capital investment, CEOs expressing some doubt about the future, but the consumer holding steady. Here to explain where he thinks the U.S. economy is headed, we welcome now Jason Furman. He's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama, and now a Harvard Kennedy School professor of practice of economic policy. He comes to us today from Cambridge. So welcome, Jason. Good to have you back with us. You provided some graphs that we can put up that sort of track back shortly before the tax cuts, shortly after the tax cuts, exactly whether there was growth or not. And you can describe them, but when looking at your graphs, it looked to me like it's sort of indeterminate, not quite clear.
Yeah. I looked at growth in the 6 quarters before the tax cuts and compared it to the 6 quarters after. The growth rate was basically the same in those 2 periods. What's important is that investment growth slowed a tiny bit. If you look underneath investment growth, actually equipment and software and R&D increased a lot. So equipment and structures actually slowed a lot. You don't see that in the graph there. That was made up for by the big increase in government spending we've seen in the last year and a half.
So as an economist, are you puzzled by this? Because whether one thought that fiscal stimulus was a good idea or a bad idea, given the timing, one would normally think if you could take upwards of $1.5 trillion and inject it into the economy, it would have an effect. You'd see it.
Yeah, look, I think there probably was some fiscal stimulus, and absent the law, for all we know, growth would have fallen more than what it did there. I think what's notable, though, is there's no evidence for the tax cuts creating much more of an incentive to invest. Maybe a small one, maybe for certain types of investments. Maybe we're going to see that over the next 5 or 10 years. But nothing so large that it jumps out at you from the data when, which is affected by so many different factors.
Jason, as I said in the introduction, there are economists now that are concerned that there's some softening, certainly globally and even in the United States. The question being, is it going to bleed from, as it were, the business side over into the consumer side? What is your take on that? We got some Conference Board numbers out that actually were a bit down on consumer confidence.
Yeah, the thing I would look at most is what's happening with jobs, what's happening with wages. That's been quite good lately, and that can continue to support consumer spending as long as we're continuing to see that job growth and wage growth. That consumer reading for September, there was a lot of noise being made about trade, a lot of noise being made about the Fed. That definitely weighed on consumer confidence. That's definitely a negative for the economy. But until it translates into actual jobs and wages, I'm not sure how large and enduring a negative it will be.
In terms of a job creation, are we fighting against a larger phenomenon? We just put a graph up, actually, that showed the percentage of GDP from labor, which has been going down for quite some long time, a little bit up and down, but overall it's a downward trend in the United States for all sorts of reasons. I'm sure part of it's technology, other reasons. Are we fighting against a larger trend here?
Yeah, I think a lot of what a chart like that shows you is it tells you something about inequality, that more money is going to profits, less money is going to wages. And, I don't think that's due to some deep technological factor. I think that's due to things like allowing the minimum wage to decline, a weakening of unions over time. And if we had a stronger labor market, workers in a stronger position to bargain, I think we could do a whole lot better in terms of something like that labor share of income.
So that makes sense, but at the same time, as we shift from a manufacturing economy to a services economy, which we have been doing, and we see the enormous value of intellectual property from a lot of the high-tech companies which are showing a lot of most of the growth, doesn't that almost necessarily feed into some of the inequality you're talking about?
It definitely does, but it also depends with how you cope with it. We had a big shift from agriculture to manufacturing in the 1920s and 1930s. We responded to that by making high school universal and free for everyone. We should be doing something like that. I'm not necessarily saying free college, but something to make college more available, to make preschool more available. So we need to be equipping people with skills to take advantage of these technological shifts. Then you wouldn't see that big adverse shift in labor income.
So as we look into this 2020 election year, is anyone coming forward and really putting an emphasis on the sort of education and training that you're talking about?
You certainly hear various Democratic candidates talking about college. I think some of the ideas are overly expensive and would have poor bang for the buck in terms of actually getting new people to attend college. But I certainly think a lot of what has been focused on there, both college and preschool, I think those are the two big missing elements that we could improve on. The fact that the United States is 20th in the world, in the rich world, in the fraction of its students that go to preschool, I think is terrible, and we should do something about that.
Okay, Jason, always great to have you with us. Really appreciate it. That's Jason Furman of the Harvard Kennedy School. He's a professor there. Coming up, President Trump lets the Goujon and General Assemblies that President Trump tells the UN General Assembly that he won't accept a bad deal with China. But how did the speech go over with the business community? We'll talk with Myron. He is Executive Vice President of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce next, and this is Bloomberg. You're watching Balance of Power. I'm David Weston. Reports overnight say that China has agreed to waive tariffs on between 2 and 3 million tons of soybean imports from the United States, raising hopes once again that there may be progress coming on the U.S.-China trade dispute. But President Trump threw a wrench in all that with his tough talk against China at the UN. Welcome now, Myron, Executive Vice President and Head of International Affairs at the United States Chamber of Commerce. Welcome, Myron. Good to have you in New York. So, what is it? Are we making progress or are we not?
David, it's great to be back on. Let me say that I think the president is sending two messages. He's saying to China, a small deal, a skinny deal is not enough. We need a big deal that deals with intellectual property, forced technology transfers, all the issues he's been talking about and the team has been talking about for the past year. But he's also saying to President Xi, we have a good relationship. We can get a deal done so long as you come to the table. Now we're going to have to wait to see what happens with the talks in early October. I expect Vice Premier Liu He to be in Washington around the October 10th timeframe. We're not really going to know more until after that, but there was clearly a message here. No small deal. Let's focus on a high standard comprehensive deal.
Where's the business community on this? I mean, President Trump talks about the farmers, for example, who've been reasonably patient with him, but patience runs out. Where's the business community?
Well, I think what the business community wants first and foremost is certainty. We want certainty in the markets. We want certainty in our trading relationships. China and the United States need to reach some kind of accommodation, find some way to get a path towards that certainty. That's not going to happen unless China comes to the table and makes an offer that is acceptable. But at the same time, the United States has to do something about the tariffs that have been put in place. Hurts farmers, hurts manufacturers, hurts consumers. So that's the big one. But let's not lose sight of the fact we got an opportunity with the USMCA. We're hopeful that that will be passed later this fall. I think before Thanksgiving, we still have a very good shot. Speaker Pelosi has had good consultations with Lighthizer and with President Trump. So there's some positive news out there as well.
So talk about the USMCA, because it's pending there, and it's been, as I understand, a Democratic House issue, basically. They're the ones that are holding it up. They say they want some improvements made in things like worker rights and things like that. Why do the Democrats want to give President Trump a win just before the 2020 election?
Well, I think they've gotten some things from this administration on workers' rights, on environmental standards. These are issues that Mexico has moved on. So if they want to get those wins, they've got to work with the administration and the business community to see it pass. So they have a vested interest in this deal being done. Otherwise, it's NAFTA. If they want the new USMCA to get through with all these new standards that they've been negotiating with the administration, they have only one course of action, and that's to work with the administration, business community to see it done.
So your best judgment is by Thanksgiving?
I think before Thanksgiving we can get USMCA passed. Absolutely.
Last question, Japan, because the president says that's coming. We don't have it yet. Are we going to get a deal with Japan?
I think we're going to see progress this week. Obviously, the president and Prime Minister Abe are going to be together, sign an understanding. I don't think it'll be the agreement. I think they're technical work. At the end of the day, we want to see the threat of tariffs removed on the auto issue, 232 auto issue. But more importantly, we want to see the bigger deal down the road. It's a good start. It's not enough. We need progress on services, on the health sector, many areas that were not covered in this agreement. So we need to see the two administrations commit also to build a bigger deal in that relationship.
Myron, great to have you here. Really a treat to have you
Thank you,
in New York. That's Myron Brilliant. He is Executive Vice President of the United States Chamber of Commerce. Coming up, a big lineup tomorrow from the Global Business Forum. The CEOs of J.P. Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, and Credit Suisse are among those we'll be talking with. That's tomorrow, and this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television. I'm David Weston. We have gotten to know President Trump as Commander-in-Chief and American First Booster-in-Chief and even Twitter-in-Chief. But a new book says if we really want to understand our 45th President of the United States, we have to understand him as Plaintiff-in-Chief. It's written by a lifelong litigator, James Zirin, who was a prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office of the Southern District of New York and went on to a distinguished legal career here in New York. And we welcome him now to Bloomberg. Welcome. Great to have you here.
Thank you for having me, David.
So it's important actually the subtitle, A Portrait of Donald Trump in 3,500 Lawsuits. And as you point in the book, we're not sure, maybe more than that.
Well, the American Bar Association said 4,000. These are the lawsuits he had before he took office. And a little more than half, he was the plaintiff in chief, and the others, he was on the receiving end.
Now, he must have won some.
Oh, yes, he did win some. Most of them he settled. In most of them, the documents either no longer exist or are sealed. I don't go into every other lawsuit, but I go into in the book, but I go into the types of lawsuits that he had, which are quite interesting.
From your book, we learn it goes all the way back. I mean, I think 1972 was the lawsuit that involved him and his
73.
father.
That was the race discrimination case.
Him and his father got sued.
Yes.
And he looked around for a lawyer, and he found one.
In a bar.
Yeah.
And his name was Roy Cohn.
Exactly. Who figures it largely in this book. Roy Cohn, for people who don't remember, was a very prominent lawyer in New York for a long time.
Yes, and the subject of a documentary film called Where's My Roy Cohn, which is just opened in all the theaters.
But he learned from Roy Cohn 3 basic principles that you go through in the book, basically.
Yes. Well, the first principle is always counterattack.
Yeah.
In the race discrimination case, where other lawyers had said to Trump, you can settle and take a consent decree and neither admit nor deny that you discriminated, Cohn's advice was, let's beat him. And the first thing he did was he counterclaimed against the government for $100 million. Well, the court threw that out in about 2 weeks. But it kept the government on its heels, always counterattack. The second principle is always undermine and try to smear your adversary. Cohn had done that successfully with Morgenthau. He was acquitted 3 times after being indicted in the Southern District of New York. And the third principle is always work the press. In the race discrimination case, the first thing they did was call a press conference.
Yeah, and as a practical matter, what Roy Cohn said is no matter how bad it looks, declare victory.
Oh, yes.
Say you're winning, no matter what.
Yes, declare victory and go home, no matter what happens.
Okay, so apply those now to the present day, for example. We have now the situation with the communication. We don't know really what it was. We're not being told yet what it was between the President of the United States and the leader of Ukraine. That apparently, reportedly, maybe had something to do with investigating Vice President Biden's son. Now, clearly, President Trump is talking about it even right now with Boris Johnson. We just saw him at the UN talking about it. What's the president's normal response as plaintiff-in-chief?
Well, as plaintiff-in-chief, he's obligated under the law to release the whistleblower's report and the tape of the conversation to the United States Congress.
He's obligated under law, but he hasn't done that. And the time has passed. There's a time on that.
Because the first thing Roy Cohn taught him was that a subpoena doesn't have to be complied with. You just tear it up and see what happens. And maybe litigate the subpoena, and maybe it'll go away. And then you deflect and you deny and you play for time, and that's what Trump is doing.
Does President Trump have a Roy Cohn now? We've heard that even in the White House sometimes he said, where's my Roy Cohn?
Well, he said that to McGahn because he was dissatisfied with Jeff Sessions, who had recused himself as Attorney General because Sessions wasn't firing Mueller. But there is no real, I mean, one Roy Cohn he has is Bill Barr. Bill Barr seems to give a legal explanation that vindicates Trump every time an issue arises. But there's no one quite so underhanded, so ethically incorrect as Roy Cohn. He would always find a way out. He'd find a way to beat the system, and that's what attracted him to Donald Trump.
So as we take all of this, the 3,500 or more lawsuits and things, is there anything wrong about it?
It's wrong because he had a litigious personality. He had 5 times as many suits as all the leading real estate people in America had combined, at least as many as the top 5 combined. This is abnormal. This is unusual. And one of the reasons is he sued people at the top of a hat. Drop of a hat. His Chinese partner said he likes litigation for lunch, and he would, whenever he was sued, he would, a la Roy Cohn, he would counterclaim for $1 billion. Usually the counterclaim was dismissed.
So the bar and the courts have certain rules and regulations to try to deter frivolous litigation. I mean, back when I practiced law, there's a Rule 11 in the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure.
Still exists.
That you get sanctioned if you're being frivolous.
Yes.
Has he been sanctioned, the President of the United States?
Well, he hasn't personally been sanctioned. I suppose he'd take the position the President of the United States can never be sanctioned.
But as a litigator...
well, the lawyers can be sanctioned if they bring frivolous litigation. That's what's so strange about the current litigation with Cy Vance, where Cy Vance has subpoenaed the Trump Organization and subpoenaed the Trump Organization's outside accountants, and Trump sued for an injunction. Now, on the face of it, and it went to the federal court to do it. On the face of it, there's a statute of Congress which goes back to the dawn of the Republic, 2283, which says that a federal court will not interfere with state court proceedings. It's called the Anti-Injunction Act. So it ought to be dismissed out of hand. These lawyers brought the case, and in my view, they should be sanctioned.
So give some advice to somebody who would be an adversary to President Trump. How do you deal? You've been an advocate for many years. You must have had lawyers on the other side who were just really litigious, really litigious. How do you deal with that? What's the proper response? I mean, do you match them in kind?
Well, normally, you try to fight the case on the merits. The Cohn-Trump idea was to wage an asymmetrical war, where you would try to undermine the adversary, call it a witch hunt, try to say that try to tarnish the adversary in any way you can. And that's what they did in the race discrimination case. They said that the Justice Department lawyers were acting like stormtroopers, which was ridiculous.
So I think it's important to emphasize, you explain in the book, you actually are a Republican.
Yes.
Moderate Republican. So you voted for Republicans. So you're not a Democratic partisan. At the same time, you say some things that are not very flattering about Donald Trump in this book. Have you been sued yet? Are you going to be sued?
Well, I hope so, because it'll spur the sales of the book. I mean, that's what happened with Michael Wolff when he tried to enjoin the publication of the book, but by Macmillan, who happens to be my publisher. But he hasn't given me any notice that he plans to sue me, and I doubt that he will. Every word in the book has been carefully researched and documented.
So after you've been through this remarkable review of litigation for Donald Trump, what do you know about him today that you didn't know when you started out?
I think what I didn't know was the tremendous influence that Roy Cohn had on him. And I was able to corroborate that when I met with Cindy Adams, who was a close friend of both men. And on election night 2016, when the result was known, he turned to Cindy Adams and he said, "Cindy, if Roy were here, he never would have believed it." Now, Cohn had been dead at that point for 30 years.
Okay, thanks so much to James Zirin, author of Plaintiff in Chief. We want to go right now to President Trump and Prime Minister Modi of India.
आपके साथ मौजूद थे और आज बहुत सी बातें हमें यहाँ पर विचार करनी है। मुख्य तौर पे व्यापार की बातें होंगी और साथ ही कश्मीर के बारे में भी बातें होंगी और बहुत सी बातें हैं जिन पर हम बात करेंगे और मैं ये कहना चाहूँगा कि भारत और अमेरिका के संबंध इसमें सबसे ज़्यादा प्रगाढ़ हैं, सबसे ज़्यादा मजबूत हैं। धन्यवाद।
मैं राष्ट्रपति ट्रंप का बहुत आभारी हूँ कि ह्यूस्टन स्वयं समय निकाल करके आए, काफ़ी समय दिया और अमेरिका में रहने वाले भारतीयों के लिए ये बहुत ही गर्व का अवसर था और मैं इसके लिए राष्ट्रपति ट्रंप का हृदय से बहुत बहुत आभार व्यक्त करता हूं। हमारी नई सरकार बनने के बाद अभी 4 महीने भी नहीं हुए हैं, लेकिन मुझे राष्ट्रपति ट्रंप के साथ
Okay, we're listening to Prime Minister Modi of India. We'll keep watching that and bring it in as they make headlines. But this time, I want to turn to Abigail Doolittle because I understand the markets are moving, and particularly tech.
You're right about that, David. And before we talk about the sell-off that we're seeing, I'm just hearing right now that we have breaking news that Newman is expected to step down as WeWork's CEO, pressure from that board. So something to take in note as well. So we've had this somewhat frothy IPO market. So the fact that you do have a CEO stepping down and the governance there and the valuation, that's perhaps a little bit of a pressure. But the pressure started more so. Would you like to add more to that?
Well, just that I understand he will remain chairman of the parent company. And this is a report, I think, according to Dow Jones, as we're getting just as we're breaking right now.
Okay.
So they were talking about him having a non-executive role, so he would stay with the company, the parent company.
Yes. Okay. And so and not be a day-to-day, so to speak. And as far as the sell-off, it really started more so in the 11 o'clock hour. President Trump, of course, speaking at the UN and between 10 and 11, and criticizing China around trade. Of course, Myron was brought up. So we started to see at that time a reversal. Overnight, the Nasdaq 100 futures had been up 0.5%. Now we're looking at the worst day in more than a month. But David, you know, this isn't really new. Each day seems to be a new playing ground. One day investors and traders are positive about trade. The next day they're negative. So the volatility that we're seeing makes sense because the S&P 500 unable to get above that 3,000 level. Investors looking for the next big directional cue, really.
Well, it's that uncertainty CEOs are feeling about trade. But even listening to President Trump Trump in those remarks. He went into great detail about Myron coming in, and they took out a patent, and then the Chinese had a patent, a very similar thing, and they wouldn't let the goods in. So it was clear, at least I thought from those remarks, the president is not backing down on this intellectual property issue.
Yeah, it seems that he is not backing down at all. You know, and it's interesting, Tom Orlick, Bloomberg Economics, he's making the point, and he's making it more around tweets, but he's saying that the uncertainty factor that you're talking about is more of a weight on the global economy, and then you would think that that would play forward to the stock market than the actual tariffs. So the fact that we had that conversation, those remarks at the UN backs it up. And something to keep in mind, we've actually had this big bond rally. Up until yesterday, bonds had been higher. They're higher again today, but basically a 7-day winning streak. Yesterday, they finished fractionally lower, but the fact that you've had stocks trying to make these new all-time highs, bonds rallying, tells you some investors have been going to that safety, treading water to some degree. So again, volatility.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you so much, Abigail Doolittle, for that report on the markets. Coming up, Money Undercover with Lisa Abramowitz. That's at 1 o'clock this afternoon Eastern Time. And then at 1:30 Eastern, we'll hear from incoming ECB President Christine Lagarde, who will reflect on her time as Managing Director of the IMF. And sign up for the Balance of Power newsletter at BloombergPolitics.com to get the latest on global politics in your inbox every day. And also check out I Am Balance on your Bloomberg terminal. This is Bloomberg.